In this lesson, we are going to continue to learn about the compromises. Remember, the first compromise that we learned about was a union of the Virginia and New Jersey plans that was known as the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise was to please both large and small states. And in the Great Compromise, a Senate was created where there would be equal representation from each state, which was reminiscent of the New Jersey plan, who wanted a unicameral legislature equal for each state. And in the Great Compromise, a proportional House was created where there would be differing representatives or differing number of representatives for the states based on their population. And this was reminiscent of the Virginia plan. Also reminiscent of the Virginia plan is the New Jersey plan wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, but the Virginia plan called for the writing of a new constitution. Following the Great Compromise comes the issue of slaves. If slaves were allowed to be counted for population purposes, this would give slave states more representation in the House of Representatives, because that's the one that was based on population. Well, southern states like South Carolina wanted all the slaves to be counted as population. They wanted one-to-one representation based on slaves. However, northern states, whose argument was, well, in the South, slaves are considered property, so how are you counting them as population? They wanted none of the slaves to be counted. And in the end, there had to be a compromise. And that compromise would be the 3/5 compromise, where the slave states, for purposes of determining the representatives in the House of Representatives, would get to count 3 slaves out of 5 for population purposes. So in a state that had 500,000 slaves, they would get to count 300,000 for determining the votes in the House of Representatives. So once again, one of the motives behind the 3/5 compromise was the northern states wanted to prevent the southern states from having control of the House of Representatives. And if slaves were allowed to count equally, as southern states and Charles Pinckney wanted, then the southern states would most likely have control of the House of Representatives. Here's another graphic of the 3/5 compromise, which was to determine the representation in the House of Representatives, where a slave counted as 3/5 of a person, but more easily understood is 5 slaves count as 3 people. South Carolina did not support this, which is why I drew Charles Pinckney as quite angry. The last thing that we learned about was the concerns that South Carolina had with the federal regulation of trade. South Carolina did not want any regulation on trade because they exported cash crops and they imported slaves. So any regulation on trade would adversely affect South Carolina. So, partially in part because South Carolina agreed to the 3/5 compromise, a compromise was made concerning trade. This compromise was known as the Commerce Compromise, and the Commerce Compromise had two parts. The federal government promised not to tax exports, which would be the cash crops that South Carolina sells, rice and indigo, and not to regulate the slave trade for 20 years, which would be the imports that South Carolina brings into the state. In all, South Carolina delegates, which included Charles Pinckney and a man named John Rutledge, if you remember, Edward Rutledge signed the Constitution. I imagine they were brothers, but a powerful planter family in South Carolina. South Carolina was satisfied with the Constitution, even though they did not get everything they wanted, such as equal representation for the slaves, and they returned to South Carolina to lobby for its ratification, which would be required for South Carolina to become an official member of the United States. The ratifying convention would go something like this. Charles Pinckney and the other South Carolina delegates would return to South Carolina to show the South Carolina legislature, which was in Columbia, I believe, at this time, that the new Constitution. So all of the delegates that were at the Constitutional Convention then had to bring the Constitution back to their state so the state could vote to ratify it. So, something that Charles Pinckney and the other delegates, including Mr. Rutledge, probably got in their carries. They said, "Okay, fellow elite South Carolina planters," because that was, once again, the social status of most of the representatives from South Carolina. "Let's take this back to South Carolina to have it ratified." Which means accepted. So, they probably set off to Columbia, the capital. And they go to Columbia, the new capital. Remember, it was moved there to ease tensions between the upcountry and low country. So, off to Columbia, the capital, except when they got to Columbia, the capital, there was a sign, and it said, "No ratifying convention here. Continue to," you can probably guess where. Where do you think the ratifying convention was held, even though Columbia was the capital? Yes, continue to Charleston. So, Charles Pinckney and the delegates said, "Oh, it's in Charleston, the ratifying convention." Said, why wouldn't it be in Columbia, the capital? And then he figured it out. Said, "Oh, okay, isn't Columbia the capital? It must be the low country pushing around the up country again." So, and yes, the low country did have the ratifying convention in Charleston, which once again would make it difficult for the upcountry settlers to take part, because if you wanted to take part in the ratifying convention, you would have to travel a very long distance. I believe the way that the low country had the ratifying convention moved to Charleston was they spread rumors of a polio or smallpox outbreak, some type of disease they said was in Columbia, so they couldn't have the ratifying convention there. Regardless, it was just gamesmanship, more or less, to get the ratifying convention in Charleston, so the Low Country could have more of a influence on it. This repeats what was already said. Political tensions between the Upcountry and Low Country. The South Carolina Ratifying Convention was held in Charleston despite the capital being moved to Columbia. The Low Country elite would have more representation at the convention, and it would be easier for non-delegates to influence the proceedings, such as home field advantage, because the Upcountry lived too far away from Charleston. So, in 1788, the ratifying convention where South Carolina would decide if they were to accept the Constitution was held in Charleston, South Carolina, despite the capital being in Columbia, which made it difficult for the Upcountry settlers to take part. So Charles Pinckney and John Rutledge would continue on to Charleston, where they would probably see something like this. Here today, South Carolina Ratifying Convention. And this was so the Low Country could take part. However, ratifying the Constitution would be an important step for each state, because until the states ratify the Constitution, there would be no all that work at the Constitutional Convention would be for nothing. So the states had to ratify it in order for it to become the new government of the United States. So they would go to a place in Charleston, probably the Charleston Courthouse. And there would be two groups in each state and nationally that had opinions about the Constitution. And there were the Federalists who wanted a stronger government that the Constitution was going to create, and they wanted South Carolina to ratify it. And then there were those that still feared too much of a strong government, still feared the powers that government could have in trampling a man's rights, even if it is a legislative assembly. And they were called the Anti-Federalists. And they said that this new Constitution gives the federal government too much power. So, it would be arguments for and against the Constitution at this ratifying convention in Charleston. And it was here that South Carolina was deciding, should we become a member of the United States? Well, each side had differing arguments, and we are going to investigate those arguments. The Federalists were led by Charles Pinckney in South Carolina and other members of the elite. They argued for a strong government that could be influential in foreign affairs and establish better trade relations. The Anti-Federalists were opponents of the new Constitution. These were mostly backcountry people. They were opposed to a stronger federal government. They feared it might trample their rights. They feared the elite would have too much power and abuse the rights of the individual. They also feared that the national government would be located too far away from the people. So, this argument of whether to become a state was between, and this was not just in South Carolina. There were Federalists and Anti-Federalists all over the United States. The Federalists were the elite. Charles Pinckney was one of those elites. And you will forever remember Charles Pinckney as a Federalist who wanted a strong national government. Now, the Anti-Federalists, one of the main Anti-Federalists that were present at this ratifying convention was this gentleman who fought the British using guerrilla tactics, and they burned his house down, which is what caused him to become a fearsome partisan leader. Yes, one of the main Anti-Federalists was the Gamecock, Thomas Sumter. And the arguments between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were, the Federalists said, we need stronger national governments. We need a stronger national government to be influential in foreign affairs. So we have to become a world power. The United States, we can't be thought of as a bunch of states that bicker and can't agree as we are under the Articles of Confederation. We need muscle to handle, as lame arm, let me try to do it better. We need muscle to handle these foreign governments. All right, not my best arm. I'll try to do better. And if we have a stronger national government, we can establish better trade relations, and we can restore economic stability and get out of that depression that we are in. Well, Thomas Sumter's like, that's all great. We would love to be that way, but we still fear too much power. You and your elite buddies will have too much power and become like new kings. You will abuse our rights. And we have an additional problem. The capital in Philadelphia is too far away. So, after much bickering and discussion, eventually, though, another compromise was made. And that compromise was to protect the individual. And what was made was, they said, fine, this plan for government's great, but there is no protection for the individual in this government. We need protection for the individual. So tell the Constitution to add a Bill of Rights where individuals in our country will be protected. And us Anti-Federalists might agree. Well, in the end, the Anti-Federalists eventually jumped on board the new government, and South Carolina would become the 8th state to join the USA because they ratified the Constitution. which allowed them to become an official member of the United States. Let's look at the PowerPoint for just a few minutes and review some of this stuff. So, South Carolina ratifies the Constitution, as did many other states, in fact, all the states. And the Federalists then would win the argument because they were the ones that wanted the Constitution ratified in the first place and wanted the stronger government that it would provide. South Carolina becomes the 8th state to join the United States of America, but a compromise had to be made in order to have the Constitution ratified. The Anti-Federalists required that a Bill of Rights be added to the Constitution to protect the individual's rights, which the Constitution had in its present form no such thing in it to protect individuals. In the end, Ben Franklin, who was a very key player at the Constitutional Convention, made a good statement, and this was prior to the ratifying convention that would have to be held in the states, but he said, "Do you see the picture of the sun painted on the back of General Washington's chair? I confess that often during the convention, I looked at that sun without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now I know the sun is rising on our great nation." And a rising sun being the beginning of the day, the beginning of the great nation of the United States of America. Thank you for listening. I hope you did well.